History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8 The Latest Age. Chapter 1 Perspectives. The New Plenty. Population and urbanization dynamics both imply a huge growth in world resources. To simplify the question ruthlessly, though many have starved, many more have lived. Millions may have died in famines, but there has so far been no worldwide Malthusian disaster. If the world had not been able to feed them, human numbers would be smaller. Whether this can continue for long is another question. Experts have concluded that we can, for a good while to come, provide food for growing numbers. There is still hope, too, that population policy may help to stabilize demand. But in such matters, we enter the realms of speculation, though the very existence of such hopes interests the historian, for they say something about a present and actual state of the world, where what is believed to be possible is important in setting what will happen. In considering that, we have to recognize the major economic fact of modern history, and especially of the last half century, that it brought about an unprecedented production of wealth. Readers of this book are probably used to seeing harrowing pictures of famine and deprivation on their television screens. Yet, over much of the world since 1945, continuing economic growth has, for the first time, come to be taken for granted. It has become the norm in spite of hiccups and interruptions along the way. Any slowing down in its rate now provokes alarm. What is more, as population figures show, in gross terms, real economic growth has been the story in most of the underdeveloped world. Against the background of the way the world still thought, even in 1939, this can be accounted a revolution. Yet that story does not just begin with the decades since the end of the Second World War, the golden age of unprecedented growth. The appropriate historical background for the surge in wealth creation that has successfully carried the burden of soaring world population is much deeper. One way of measuring it is to reflect that the average human being today commands about 9 times the wealth of an average human being in 1500. The world's gross domestic product, GDP, has risen from a base of 105 centuries ago to a figure of more than 11,600 today, but has, of course, to be shared between many more people. Wealth and human numbers indeed tended to rise more or less in parallel until the 19th century. Then, some economies began to display much faster growth than others. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, a new intensification of wealth creation was already underway, which, though badly set back by two world wars and the upheavals caused by the depression of the 1930s, was to be resumed after 1945 and has barely ceased since, in spite of serious challenges and striking contrasts between different economies. GDP rose almost everywhere after 1960 and generally per capita too. For all the huge disparities and setbacks in some countries, economic growth has taken place much more widely than ever before. Selected if the overriding fact is one of wealth creation. It must have helped that the major powers were at peace with one another for so long. The world since 1945 have, of course, been studied with many bloody, smaller scale or incipient conflicts, while men and women have died every day of them. Hundreds of thousands in warlike operations or their aftermath. The great powers have had much fighting done for them by surrogates. Yet, no such destruction of human and economic capita as that of the two world wars took place. The international rivalry that underlay often notable tension tended rather to sustain or provoke economic activity in many countries. It provided much technological spin off and led to major capital investments and transfers for political motives, some of which did much to increase real wealth. The first such transfers took place in the later 1940s when American aid made possible the recovery of Europe. For this to be successful, the American dynamo had to be available to promote recovery, as it had not been after 1918. The enormous warlike expansion of the American economy that had at last brought it out of the pre war depression, together with the immunity of the American home base from physical damage by war, had ensured that it would. Explanation for the deployment of American economic strength as aid has to be sought in circumstances of which the Cold War was an important part. International tension made it seem in America's interest to behave as it did. An imaginative grasp of opportunities was shown by many of its statesmen and businessmen. There was for a long time no alternative source of capital on such a scale. Finally, it helped that men of different nations, even before the end of the war, had already set in place institutions for regulating the international economy in order to avoid any return to the near fatal economic anarchy of the 1930s. The story of the reshaping of the economic life of the world thus begins before 1945 in the wartime efforts that produced the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The economic stability they provided in the non communist world after 1945 underpinned 2 decades of growth in world trade at nearly 7% per annum in real terms. Between 1945 and the 1980s, the average level of tariffs on manufactured goods fell from 40% to 5%, and world trade multiplied more than fivefold. Over a longer term, still, scientists and engineers were making their contributions to economic growth in less formal, often less visible ways. The continued application of scientific knowledge through technology and the improvement and rationalization of processes and systems in the search for greater efficiency were all very important before 1939. They came more dramatically to the fore and began to exercise even greater influence after 1945. What they meant in agriculture, where improvement had begun long before industrialization, was a recognizable phenomenon, is one of the clearest examples of their effects. For thousands of years, farmers edged their returns upwards almost entirely by ancient methods, above all, by clearing and breaking in new land. There is still a lot left that, with proper investment, could be made to raise crops, and much has been done in the last 25 years to use such land, even in the crowded country like India. Yet, this does not explain why world agricultural output has recently risen so dramatically. The root explanation is a continuation and acceleration of the agricultural revolution that began in early modern Europe and has been visible at least from the 17th century. 250 years later, it was vastly speeded up thanks largely to applied science. Well before 1939, wheat was being successfully introduced to lands in which, for climatic reasons, it had not been grown hitherto. Plant geneticists had evolved new strains of cereals, one of the first 20th century scientific contributions to agriculture on a scale going far beyond the trial and error improvement of earlier times. Much Later, did genetic modification of crop species begin to attract adverse criticism. Even greater contributions to world suppliers had by then been made in areas already growing grain by using better chemical fertilizers, of which the first had become available in the 19th century. An unprecedented rate of replacement of nitrogen in the soil underlay the larger yields that have now become commonplace in countries with advanced agriculture. Their costs include huge energy inputs, though, and fears of ecological consequences began to be expressed in the 1960s. By then, better fertilizers had been joined by effective herbicides and insecticides too, while the use of machinery in agriculture had grown enormously in developed countries. England had, in 1939, the most mechanized farming in the world in terms of horsepower per acre cultivated. English farmers nonetheless did much of the work with horses, while combined harvesters, already familiar in the United States, were rare. But not only were the fields mechanized, the coming of electricity brought automatic milking, grain drying, threshing, the heating of animal sheds in winter. Now, the computer and automation have begun to reduce dependence on human labor even more. In the developed world, the agricultural workforce has continued to fall, while production per acre has risen and genetically modified crops promise even greater yields. For all that, paradoxically, there may well be more subsistence farmers in the world today than in 1900, just because there are more people. Their share of cultivated land and of the value of the crops produced, though, has fallen. The 2% of the farmers who lived in developed countries now supply about half of the world's food. In Europe, the peasant is fast disappearing, as he disappeared in Great Britain 200 years ago. But this change has been unevenly spread and easily disrupted. Russia was traditionally one of the great agricultural economies, but as recently as 1947 suffered famine so severe as to provoke outbreaks of cannibalism once more. Local dearth is still a danger in countries with large and rapidly growing populations, where subsistence agriculture is the norm and productivity remains low. Just before the First World War, the British yield of wheat per acre was already more than 2.5 times that of India. By 1968, it was roughly 5 times. Over the same period, the Americans raised their rice yield from 4.25 to nearly 12 tons an acre, while that of Burma, once the rice bowl of Asia, rose only from 3.8 to 4.2. In 1968, one agricultural worker in Egypt was providing food for slightly more than one family, while in New Zealand, each farm employee was producing enough for 40. Countries economically advanced in other ways show the greatest agricultural productivity. Countries in greatest need have found it impossible to produce crops more cheaply than can leading industrial economies. Ironic paradoxes result. The Russians, Indians, and the Chinese, big grain and rice producers, have found themselves buying American and Canadian wheat. Disparities between developed and underdeveloped countries have widened in the decades of plenty. Roughly half of mankind now consumes about 6/7 of the world's production. The other half shares the rest. The United States has been the most extravagant consumer by far. In 1970, the half dozen or so Americans in every 100 human beings used about 40 of every 100 barrels of oil produced in the world each year. They each consumed annually roughly a quarter ton of paper products. The corresponding figure for China was then about 20 pounds. The electrical energy used by China for all purposes in a year at that time would be, it is said, just have sustained the supply of power to the United States air conditioners. Electricity production, indeed, is one of the best ways of making comparisons since relatively little electrical power is traded internationally and most of it is consumed in the country where it is generated. At the end of the 1980s, the United States produced nearly 40 times as much electricity per capita as India, 23 times as much as China, and only 1.3 times as much as Switzerland. In all parts of the world, the disparity between rich and poor nations has grown more and more marked since 1945. Not usually because the poor have grown poorer, but because the rich have grown much richer. Almost the only exceptions to this were to be found in the comparatively rich by poor world standard economies of the Russia and Eastern Europe, where mismanagement and the exigencies of a command economy imposed lower growth rates or even no growth at all. With these exceptions, even spectacular accelerations of production. Some Asian countries, for example, pushed up their agricultural output between 1952 and 1970, proportionately more than Europe and much more than North America, have rarely succeeded in improving the position of poor countries in relation to that of the rich because of their rising populations, and rich countries, in any case, began at a higher level. Although their rankings in relation to one another may have changed, those countries that enjoyed the highest standards of living in 1950 still, by and large, enjoy them today and have been joined by Japan. These are the major industrial countries. Their economies are today the richest per capita, and their example spurs poorer countries to seek their own salvation in economic growth, which is too often read as industrialization. True, major industrial economies today do not much resemble their 19th century predecessors. The old heavy and manufacturing industries, which long provided the backbone of the economic strength, are no longer simple and satisfactory measures of it. Once staple industries in leading countries have declined. Of the three major steel making countries of 1900, the first two, the USA and West Germany, were still among the first five world producers 80 years later, but in third and fifth places respectively. The United Kingdom, third in 1900, came 10th in the same world table with Spain, Romania, and Brazil close on her heels. Nowadays, Poland makes more steel than did the United States a century ago. What is more, newer industries often found a better environment for rapid growth in some developing countries than in the mature economies. Thus, the people of Taiwan came by 1988 to enjoy per capita GDP nearly 18 times that of India, while that of South Korea too was 15 times as big. 20th century economic growth has often been in sectors. Electronics and plastics are examples, which barely existed even in 1945, and in new sources of power. Coal replaced running water and wood in the 19th century as the major source of industrial energy, but long before 1939, it was joined by hydroelectricity, oil, and natural gas. Very recently, power generated by nuclear fission was added to these. Industrial growth has raised standards of living as power costs have come down, and with them, those of transport. One particular innovation was of huge importance. In 1885, The first vehicle propelled by internal combustion was made. One, that is to say, in which the energy produced by heat was used directly to drive a piston inside the cylinder of an engine, instead of being transmitted to it via steam made in a boiler with an external flame. 9 years later came a four-wheeled contraption made by the French Panhard Company, which is a recognizable ancestor of the modern car. France with Germany dominated the production of cars for the next decade or so, and they remained rich men's toys. This is automobile prehistory. Automobile history began in 1907 when Henry Ford, an American, set up a production line for what became famous as his Model T, planned deliberately for a mass market. Its price was low. By 1915, a million Ford cars were being made each year, and by 1926, the Model T cost less than $300, about £60 in British money at rates then current. An enormous commercial success was underway. So was a social and economic revolution. Ford changed the world by giving the masses something previously considered a luxury and a mobility unavailable even to millionaire 50 years earlier. His impact was as great as the coming of railways. This increase in amenity was to spread around the world too, with enormous consequences. A worldwide car manufacturing industry was one result, often dominating domestic manufacturing sectors and bringing eventually large scale international integration. In the 1980s, eight large producers made three out of the four of the world's cars. The industry stimulated huge investments in other sectors too. Only a few years ago, half of the robots employed in the world's industry were welders in car factories, and another quarter painted their products. Over a similarly long term, car production enormously stimulated demand for oil. Huge numbers of people came to be employed in the supplying fuel and other services to car owners. Investment in road building became a major concern of governments as it had not been since the days of the Roman Empire. Ford, like many other great revolutionaries, had brought other men's ideas to bear on his own. In the process, he also transformed the workplace. Stimulated by his example, assembly lines became the characteristic way of making consumer products. On those set up by Ford, the motor car moved steadily from worker to worker, each one of them carrying out in the minimum necessary time the precisely delimited and, if possible, simple task in which he or later she was skilled. The psychological effect on the worker was soon deplored, but Ford saw that such work was very boring and paid high wages, thus also making it easier for his workers to buy his cars. This was a contribution to another fundamental social change, the cultural consequences of incalculable significance, the fueling of economic prosperity by increasing purchasing power and therefore demand. Communication. Some assembly lines nowadays are manned entirely by robots. The single greatest technological change to affect the major industrial societies since 1945 has come in the huge field of what is comprehensively called information technology, the complex science of devising, building, handling, and managing electronically powered machines that process information. Few innovatory waves in the history of technology have rolled in so fast. Applications of work done only during the Second World War were widely diffused in services and industrial processes over a couple of decades. This was most obvious in the spread of computers, electronic data processors, of which the first only appeared in 1945. Rapid increases in power and speed, reductions in size, and improvements in visual display capacity brought a huge increase in the amount of information that could be ordered and processed in a given time. Quantitative change, though, brought qualitative transformation. Technical operations hitherto unfeasible because of the mass of data involved now became possible. Intellectual activity had never been so suddenly accelerated. Moreover, at the same time as there was revolutionary growth in the power of computers, so there was in their availability, cheapness, and portability. Within 30 years, a microchip the size of a credit card was doing the job that had at first required a machine the size of the average British living room. It was observed in 1965 that the processing power of a chip doubled every 18 months. The 2000 or so transistors carried by a chip 30 years ago have now multiplied to millions. The transforming effect have been felt exponentially and in every human activity, from money and war making to scholarship and pornography. Computers are, of course, only part of another long story of development and innovation in communication of all kinds, beginning with advances in the physical and mechanical movement of solid objects, goods, and people. The major 19th century achievements were the application of steam to land and sea communication, and later electricity and the internal combustion engine. In the air, there had been balloons, and the first dirigible airships flew before 1900. But it was only in 1903 that the first flight was made by a man carrying heavier than air machine, that is, one whose buoyancy was not derived from bags of a gas lighter than air. This announced a new age of physical transport. 80 years later, the value of goods moving through London's biggest airport was greater than through any British seaport. Millions now regularly travel by air on business and professional concerns, as well as for leisure, and flight has given a command of space to the individual only faintly imaginable as the century began. The communication and information had already advanced far into another revolution. The essence of this was the separation of the information flow from any physical connection between source and signal. In the middle of the 19th century, poles carrying the wires for the electric telegraph were already a familiar sight beside railway lines, and the process of linking the world together with undersea cables had begun. Physical links were still fundamental. Then Hertz identified the radiomagnetic wave. By 1900, scientists were exploiting electromagnetic theory to make possible the sending of the first literally wireless messages. The transmitter had the receiver no longer needed any physical connection. Appropriately, it was in 1901, the first year of the new century, to be profoundly marked by this invention, that Marconi sent the first radio message across the Atlantic. 30 years later, most of the millions who by then owned wireless receivers had ceased to believe that they needed to open windows for the mysterious waves to reach them, and large scale broadcasting systems existed in all major countries. A few years before this, the first demonstration had been made of the devices on which television was based. In 1936, the BBC opened the first regularly scheduled television broadcasting service. 20 years later, the medium was commonplace in leading industrial societies, and now that is true worldwide. Like the coming of print, the new medium had huge implications, but for their full measurements, they must be placed in the context of the whole modern era of communications development. Like the coming of print, the implications were incalculable, though they were politically and socially neutral, or rather double edged. Telegraphy and radio made information more quickly available, and this could be advantageous both to governments and to their opponents. The ambiguities of television became visible even more rapidly. Its images could expose things governments wanted to hide to the gaze of hundreds of millions, but it was also believed to shape opinion in the interests of those who controlled it. By the end of the 20th century, too, it was clear that the internet, the latest major advance in information technology, also had ambiguous possibilities. From its origins in the ARPANET, developed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the US Department of Defense in 1969. By 2000, the internet had 360 million regular users, mostly in the developed countries. By then, the ease of communication that it offered had helped revolutionize world markets and strongly influence world politics, especially in those regions that were moving towards more open political systems. E commerce, the buying and selling of consumer goods and services through the internet, became a major part of the commerce in the United States in the early 2000s, with companies such as Amazon and eBay among the wealthiest and most influential in the market. By 2005, electronic mail had replaced postal services as the preferred way of communication in North America, Europe, and parts of East Asia. But at the same time, much of the ever increasing speed capacity of internet transfers was used for watching pornographic films and playing interactive games. And with much of this capacity wasted, the social differences between those who spend much of their day online and those who have no access to the internet is increasing rapidly.